Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second lesson of two lessons involving the actual events that took place during the Civil War, or as they refer to it in the southern states, the War Between the States. Today, we're going to talk about the turning points in the war and how the war finally ended. So let's get started. So we finished off lesson 1 talking about the Battle of Antietam Creek, and we discussed how Abraham Lincoln spent most of the early parts of the war trying to keep the Union North on side as he tried to prosecute the war, insisting that the Union must be preserved, and he needed something that he could call a victory in order to keep people behind the war effort and to issue something that he was wanting to do, but finally had the ability to do, and that was the Emancipation Proclamation. This is an extraordinarily important executive order that Abraham Lincoln issued following the Battle of Antietam. He called Antietam a victory. It was really a draw, but it was a victory in that the Southern forces that were attempting to invade the North did turn back and go back to the South. So Lincoln used this victory to justify issuing a proclamation that freed all of the slaves, but here's the important distinction, only in the states that were rebelling against the Union, only in the Confederate states. So the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, which were still part of the North, still part of the Union, technically still had slavery. He was issuing the proclamation to have effect only in areas that the Union didn't actually control. Although by this point, the Union did control many parts of the South. He did not want to issue this proclamation when the Union was losing because he thought that would appear to, you're losing the war, and so now you're doing this as an act of desperation. Lincoln knew that he needed to act from strength when he did this and not from weakness. And from this point forward, the war was not just simply about forcing the southern states to rejoin the Union. The war was now about abolition. The war was now about getting rid of slavery. This was an executive order, and you'll learn what an executive order is in the second trimester of social studies. It's basically something the president has the power to do, but it's not quite as powerful as passing a law. It turned the Civil War into a war of emancipation and not just a war to force the South back into the Union. Up until this point, the whole mantra was the Union must be preserved. The Union must be preserved. And it was not necessarily officially about eliminating slavery, even though anybody who had two brain cells could put together the fact that this war had to do with slavery. And at this point, Lincoln started recruiting African American soldiers to serve in the Northern Union armies, and this was the first time in U.S. history that had been done. There's a movie called Glory, which back in the day I used to show on the last day of class, which is literally about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which was the first African-American regiment ever to serve in the U.S. military. I highly recommend it. Many African-American regiments were formed, and many slaves escaped from the South to join those African-American regiments in the Northern Army. So, as I said earlier, if you were in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, or Delaware, which were all states that stayed in the Union, and you were an enslaved individual, unfortunately, this proclamation did not apply to you. Abraham Lincoln had a difficult political dance, and that was part of his political dance. You can ask me about that in class if you'd like. So the major turning point battle in the war, and by far the most famous battle in the Civil War, was the Battle of Gettysburg, which was in Pennsylvania. So this was another time when Robert E. Lee was attempting to invade the North in order to sway public opinion in the North against the war. Robert E. Lee had been stringing up quite a few victories. After a major victory, he marched his army north again, and his goal was simply to break the Union's will to fight. If the Union kept piling up losses, it was going to be very difficult to justify to the citizens of the North that this war was worth fighting. And when a war is fought on your own soil, it becomes a lot more real. This was by far the most decisive battle of the war. It occurred from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, so a little bit more than 2 years into the war. And it was Lee's attempt to try and break the Union Army. Instead, he broke his own. He ordered 15,000 soldiers to charge uphill at a place called Cemetery Ridge, and this became known as Pickett's Charge. So 15,000 Southern soldiers marching across an open field uphill with the Northerners just waiting for them, raining cannonballs on them, raining shots on them. This became an absolute bloodbath. And there's a scene from the movie Gettysburg which encapsulates this quite well. I believe I'm going to show it to you in class. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It is very much worth watching. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were killed, and Lee was forced to retreat. He essentially lost an entire division of soldiers because of this strategic error. And from this point forward, the South would never invade the North again. And that made this the turning point. Like I just said. So we're now in a completely different part of the country, Vicksburg. One of the northern goals was to control the Mississippi River and prevent the South from using it to transport goods or troops. And Vicksburg was a city on high ground in Mississippi that controlled a key intersection of the river. And so it was the goal of the North, in this case under General Ulysses S. Grant, that's a very important name, to break the South and control the Mississippi River. I just said that. So if the Union controlled the river, it would basically have a stranglehold on all Southern transportation because the Southerners did not have a strong railroad network. They pretty much used the rivers. So if the Union Army could control the rivers, they could control the South. And Ulysses S. Grant was a general who was not afraid of fighting, and he was not afraid of losing troops so long as the end result was he actually won. So this was an extremely bloody battle. He finally forced the Confederates to surrender, but there were a lot of dead bodies on both sides after this battle. That's one thing Abraham Lincoln liked about Ulysses S. Grant is he was willing to fight. He's willing to have soldiers die if in the end it meant victory, because victory meant bringing the war to a faster conclusion. After this battle, the Union had complete control over the Mississippi River, which is why I am talking about it, which is why this battle is important. And if you know anything about the South, there aren't a lot of places in the South that have high ground. So the fact that this was one of them is very significant. So we're going to skip to the chase here. How did the Civil War finally end? And apparently my graphics don't work here. That's okay. Under General Grant, who was the commanding general of the Union forces at the end of the war, the Union slowly ground the Confederate troops and resources down. The Union had the ability to replace those resources. The Confederates did not. So it became a battle of attrition, and eventually the Confederates got worn down so much that really continuing to fight was not sustainable. And the final rebel stand took place at a place near Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Lee was expecting his troops to get resupplied. The Union cut off his ability to resupply his troops. He pretty much saw the writing on the wall, and with no place left to retreat, he sent the white flag of surrender ahead to General Grant at a courthouse in Appomattox on April 9th, 1865, almost exactly 4 years after Fort Sumter, like 3 days short of that. General Grant realized that these were no longer rebels fighting against the U.S. government, but they were now going to be countrymen again, and so he offered very lenient terms of surrender. Confederate troops were asked to give up their guns, but they were allowed to keep their horses and return home in time for the growing season. The war was finally at an end, but an act of extraordinary irony. 6 days later, Abraham Lincoln was viewing a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., a place I have personally been to, and a disgruntled Southern sympathizer by the name of John Wilkes Booth got into the viewing stand where Lincoln was taking in the play and shot him through the head. And so Abraham Lincoln was not around to oversee what we call Reconstruction because he was assassinated. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, was elevated to the presidency, and Andrew Johnson did not have nearly the same beliefs as Abraham Lincoln. So this was a really tragic turn of events that really did change the course of history. And of course, it was the first time we had a presidential assassination in the history of the country. Abraham Lincoln was president number 16. And so this marks the end of the war and the beginning of what we call the Reconstruction era. And unfortunately, most of the time, I don't have time to get to the Reconstruction era. So if I have that time with you, I'm doing very well. All right, we have now reached the end of our 2 lessons on the events of the Civil War. Honestly, it could be a lot more than 2 lessons. I've given you the 35,000-foot summary here, but it's better than nothing. So I would like you to write a summary, and I would like you to focus on 2 things. What were the major events? So event as in Emancipation Proclamation, and battles of the Civil War. And how did the Civil War finally end? Based on everything I've given you, there should be no problem coming up with 5 to 8 sentences, writing a summary on that. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time. It is once again time for Mr. Blumendahl to sign off on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube Network.